because it's really just a roundtable format. But if you want to see it, it's the background to the conversation we're going to have here. It's at clear.org is the easiest way to go there, and then just click on the publications tab, go to reports, and it is report number 166. So otherwise, I could give you a longer URL, but that's really the easiest way to do it. So as I say, it includes a literature review, a brief history of library publishing, which goes way back in the world of print publishing, and a survey of for which we got 48 responses from members of the library publishing community. We were among the findings that we got out of the survey were that it's a remarkably diverse set of programs, publishing not just in humanities and social sciences, but a great deal in STEM of particular kinds, and that, like a lot of other publishing, it's working on limited budgets, which raises some interesting questions for the expansion, how big any given library publishing program can get. There are, of course, more libraries that can join, but without more funding coming in, it's an interesting question to see what size and scope these programs can take on. We also found, and this was no surprise, a widespread interest in the relationship between university presses and libraries. The actual formal reporting of university presses into libraries is a trend that's been increasing over years, and there are now over 30 presses that are reporting directly into the library, which has implications for the future of publishing. So, that said, we decided we would come up with a bunch of questions that kind of grow out of the report, and different folks on the panel will address a set of, I have like nine little sets of questions, and one or two or more will address each one of them, but we're a small enough group that at the end of each one, after the people on the panel are done with their comments, if anybody has a question or wants to add a comment, feel free to do so, and I'll just keep a track on time and try to keep us moving along. So, with no further ado, question one, or set of first question, what distinguishes library publishing from publishing other than organizational location? On campuses where there is also a university press, how can library publishers best distinguish their output from the presses, especially if they both publish books? When should presses and libraries work together, and when should they keep their efforts separate? Can and should they share service/vendor licenses and expenses? And Charles, you were going to address that.
Yeah, so just to explain, I'm Charles Watkinson, so I am...
I forgot
no,
to introduce you all.
that's fine.
Sorry.
I wanted to explain that I have two titles, Director of University of Michigan Press and Associate University Librarian for Publishing. So that reflects the fact that at Michigan we have a university press and we have a publishing operation that grew out of the Scholarly Publishing Office. It's now called Michigan Publishing Services. And so this issue of how the press and how the library publishing entity on campus should articulate their difference is very, very immediate for me. And in fact, when I arrived at Michigan, the Faculty Senate was conducting an inquiry into what was going on in the publishing operations at University of Michigan, because they'd become very concerned about the lack of clarity between those two entities. So the way I think about it is in terms of the fact that university presses publish in a very, very specific type of way. It's a very formal type of publishing. It's very focused on peer review, very strong editorial intervention, a lot of work on distribution, marketing. It's an extremely formal kind of publishing. It tends to be for a fairly confined group of disciplines, mainly in the humanities and qualitative social sciences, and it's primarily conducted on a revenue from sales. The problem about that form of publishing is that it's incredibly relevant to a very small group of faculty on campus, and if you're based on campus, you're leaving 2/3 of the faculty completely on the table. You have no relevance to them whatsoever, which is a difficult situation to be in. And it's kind of horrible to be a university press sometimes because your hands are shackled to a certain type of publishing, and the faculty will get very much up in arms if you start deviating. So library publishers, on the other hand, and this is why it's so great to have this option of also having a library publishing entity, their strong focus is firstly on, it's kind of disciplinarily agnostic, it's on the institution, and so they can actually engage in a lot of other different subject areas. The revenue base is different. It allows sort of chargebacks to campus units and subsidy from the library. And it can be much less formal in character. So there can be different forms of peer review, or there can be materials that aren't really peer reviewed, and so on. So I love having these two complementary entities because it allows me, as a publisher, to engage in a much wider range of communities in different ways. And we envisage it actually as kind of a spectrum of different publishing services serving a spectrum of different needs among scholars.
Any questions, comments from folks out there? Okay. Let me fix my dereliction of duty here and introduce folks. Charles has introduced himself already. Amy Brand, to my left, is the director of MIT Press as of, July? And before that, has had a remarkably varied career in university press publishing, in a founding role at Crossref, and at Harvard as somebody who had very deep ties to the faculty. Over here is Aaron McCullough, who is the Scholarly Communications and Publishing Librarian at University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. He also has university press experience and was the editorial director at University of Michigan Press for a time. Maria, who is on her way, that's Maria Bond, is a senior lecturer at the Grad School of Library and Information Science at Illinois, and also has university press experience also at Michigan. So all of these folks have both library and university press experience, which is not that typical. So it's we're really lucky to have a panel that has both. So let me move quickly on to the second question, which Aaron will tackle. So the survey that we conducted for the CLEAR report that initiated the panel's formation found that by an 80-20 margin, librarians who participated would not favor either imposing or increasing end-user funds, even if they were necessary to keep a project going. This starkly raises the question of sustainability and expansion. Excluding end users, what might be the sources of funds needed to grow and expand a library's program? Are academic libraries ready to start funding publishing operations from the materials rather than the operations budget? And what would that mean on the ground?
Okay, so one other thing I should probably mention with respect to my autobiography is that I was a collection development librarian as well. Before I was the editorial director at the press, I was the English literature and comp lit subject specialist at Michigan. And so I do have some experience with collections also. With respect to this question, I read the report closely and several times actually for my own research agenda. And I was intrigued by this 80-20 split. Sounds about right to me. It's consistent with what I see as library mission and library values. As far as the question of where funding will come from in the future, here's Maria.
I don't want to know.
Where funding will come from in the future, I'll admit right up front that when I first read this question, I took it, a little umbrage at it because it feels a little leading, and that may not be Alex's fault, but more just the way that the discourse around library publishing often goes, that librarians don't know anything about business or marketing or those kinds of things, which I often kind of rankle at. But I'll let that go for the moment and say that I think that any question of single institution budget line levels, like the materials budget, that conversation, if it ever happened, is kind of in the past, and we shouldn't be looking that direction. Among other things, that's just going to lead to more siloing, and it's not productive. Also, it would alienate individual collection development folks, and I don't want to do that. I think that, well, I know that materials budgets have already been used for publishing. It's certainly true at Michigan, and it's true at Illinois. It's not massive amounts of money, but there is expenditure going in that direction. And so I don't expect there to be more at of that sort. But setting the horizon on the cross-institutional level, I think is where we should be looking. And so looking to something like what HathiTrust did with digital libraries, that's where we should be looking in terms of big picture thinking about library publishing and where the money will come from. I also want to point out that even though library publishing has been happening now for several years, these are early days with vis-a-vis the history of publishing, right? And so we're still establishing critical mass. The Library Publishing Coalition is pretty new, but that's a place to look for this kind of collaborative work to grow, I think. And we do have some models beyond just the idea of, well, HathiTrust is a good thing to try to imitate. The Spark PKP recent response to a call for proposals from the AAA is a good place to look for ways that this kind of collaborative work could be done. And it's not just libraries, it's trying to focus on the strengths that libraries bring to the conversation, and then sharing the costs across institutions.
Aaron, I wonder if I might ask, if I'm somebody whose background is largely university presses, although I reported into a library for the last few years that I was directing one. Could you describe a little bit what some of those models, like the Spark PKP, do? I mean, how do they go about raising the money? Where does it come from?
Yeah, I was afraid you'd ask me that.
Good, you're prepared then.
I have a link you can go to where it's laid out in quite specific detail, and I can share that with anyone who wants it as well. But honestly, I don't think I can answer that question in any real way. It's basically partner organizations that would come together and say, we will commit X number of dollars if this gets off the ground. So something along the lines of what HathiTrust did, something along the lines of what partnership that I was a part of early in my career, the Text Creation Partnership, Early English Books Online model. It's consortial. It's a consortial effort. And
it might be interesting. Lisa, would you be willing to say anything about that? I mean, I know it's not your model exactly, but clearly you'd have been tracking a bit on it.
Right.
Could you introduce yourself?
I'm sorry. I'm Lisa Norberg, principal at KN Consultants, and we're working with Raim and John on the PKP collective. Our project is called the Open Access Network. I'm sorry.
No, speak up. You can stand too.
Our project is called the Open Access Network, which is a kind of a financial model, a collective financial model. John and Raim have money from the MacArthur Foundation to study collective models for publishing. So we hope to be one of their, one of the things that they're studying. So we're tracking that, the AAA and other potential models. Ours looks at kind of having institutions of higher ed and consortia come together to finance essentially all scholarly publishing infrastructure, but in an incremental, phased way.
Thanks.
Can I just ask if we could have the, some hint on how to find this document?
I'll pull it up. How about that?
Like a Google.
Thank you.
Right.
So while Aaron's doing that, I'll have one more question, I'll open it up some more to the audience on this issue. So one of the things we found out in the survey was that when there is a deficit in a given library publishing program right now, it is mostly made up by the operational budget of the library. I guess my question is, what does that imply about the ability of that given program to develop? I mean, I know it depends to some extent on where the losses come from, if it's just starting up and it's getting off the ground. But if there is a tendency to use the operational budget to cover deficits in a specific library publishing program, what does that imply in a broader sense, if anything?
Well, the first thing I would say is that when we talk about library budgets, it's important to talk about them as cost centers. So that's what you're suggesting is true of library publishing, is true of everything that the library does. So it's not a question of losses. This is a filter through which, if you've been working in an auxiliary unit, you're going to think of any shortfall or any expense, essentially, that isn't recaptured through revenue as a loss, but that's not the way the library spends money. So it becomes more of a question, and I'm sure there are many people in the room who are better equipped to talk about this library budgets than I am, but it's more a question of priorities in the library and what the library wants to spend money on, what the library values, and we'll get into those questions around how do we measure impact, how do we measure success. But if we demonstrate that what we're doing is contributing to the desires, the needs of the researchers on campus, and especially if we're able to demonstrate that this is as useful or more useful than spending money on certain kinds of collections, then money can flow in that direction.
Okay.
If I could just chirp in for 1 second on that with one of those phrases from Economics 101, it's about opportunity cost more than the direct cost. The libraries always have to make choices about strategic investment, and that means something else won't get done, and that's a real cost. But that is articulated in a different way.
Anybody want to make a comment or question? Okay. The next question, which Amy will address. Much has been made of the different cultures of the library and press worlds. Integrating different cultures can be challenging. How are we doing on this front, and how do we A, measure how we're doing, and B, define what a shared culture should look like?
So first I should say that MIT libraries don't have library publishing services in the formal way that was discussed really in the CLEAR report. What the MIT libraries do is provide copyright advisory services, data management planning services, and of course an open access repository. I mean, MIT libraries created DSpace. But the press does report up to the libraries. And actually, to go back to something that Charles said earlier about formal and informal, because the library at this point in time, and this will, I think, change over time, because they're new directors and we want to work really closely together. Some of that informal stuff, we are taking on. So we are taking on, publishing in areas that we wouldn't normally publish in an author-funded way without peer review. And we have some journals that do alternative forms of peer review as well. But with new directorship, we're really invested in aligning our organizations, aligning our cultures, and working much more closely together. In the past, because as I said, the library has been sort of overseer of the press for many years. That was a pretty distant, kind of benevolent relationship in which the director of the libraries just chaired the press management board, and there wasn't really much more than that. But going forward, it's much more of a two-way relationship. So I am considered now a senior member of the library management team. I go to library management meetings, not all of them, thank God, but some of them. And we've been examining our cultures and our values. So while our missions differ, the mission of the library is being centered around stewardship and service and largely around the MIT community, although not exclusively. And the press, of course, more focused on the global academic community and self-supporting dissemination of curated scholarship. We find that we're closely aligned on the values explicitly of adaptability and innovation, and I want to spell out what that means and what we have articulated in draft form thus far. Aim to actively engage in the changing technologies, practices, and policies around creating and sharing information. Embrace an entrepreneurial ethos that welcomes thoughtful risk-taking and isn't afraid to fail. Strive to adapt continually to the changing needs of the communities that we serve, and aspire to be a model, on the one hand, for research libraries, on the other for the university presses, of what these organizations can be in the 21st century. So I'm going to sidestep the question of how to measure that, how well we're doing, but that's some concrete food for thought and further discussion.
I would say one other thing about cultures, which is very striking working within a library now, is the confluence of interest in serving the author, the faculty member as an author of content. And for libraries, that's the end, that's a journey that's happened from really thinking about faculty members as users of content, and this journey towards faculty members as creators of content. So that suddenly aligns a lot of cultural interests and issues, I found.
Yeah, I think that's true, and when I was thinking about what libraries are being asked to do by faculty members, a lot of it is around that pre-publication authoring services stuff. I was going to come back to that later, but you're absolutely right. I mean, that is the touch point.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Just as a matter of curiosity, show of hands, how many people work either for a press that reports to a library or in a library that has a press reporting to it? Yeah, it's a decent number. Okay. And how many are with either a press or a library where the press is independent of the library, but they work together on occasional projects? Yeah, okay, thanks. Comments?
I'm Dave Shear. I'm at Carnegie Mellon University. Previously I was at Purdue, and I managed our institutional repository and worked closely with our press. And from experience, it was nice being able to have this more of a suite of services that we could offer to campus, both a mixture of traditional library services and those library services that were paid for out of the library's budget, but then being able to offer those value-added services that a press would be able to provide, and also the connections that the press has to other capabilities as well. So one thing that we did find successful was with being able to offer campus a new publishing model, especially for conferences and events, and filling a niche area on campus that there's not a lot of traditional publishers that would delve in that area. But being able to have an opportunity where we could offer something as a base layer, a foundation of services that were free based on the library's budget initiatives, but then also the value-added services that were more of an a la carte based on what the press could do and handle at the time, and or relationships with outside vendors as well. So it provided us an opportunity to have something that could be a much more dynamic service to campus, while at the same time bringing the University Press more into campus activities, not only with our faculty, but also other offices on campus, like our conferences division.
Okay. Do you want to add anything to that?
Mm-mm.
Okay, thank you. I should add, it was another interesting finding in our survey is that, perhaps not surprising to some in the room, library publishing programs are remarkably good at publishing people not just from their own universities. When a lot of people, when they hear about these informal things and data sets and things, they think local, and there is that. But in fact, the percentages of material that come from scholars at other institutions in any given library publishing program are actually quite large. Okay, I'll move on to the next one, which is back to Aaron. What are the differences in how library publishers and other types of publishers, both nonprofit and for-profit, define, measure, and communicate their success and/or impact? Is it usage, rewards, monetary and non-monetary, to authors, researchers, and students? How do we measure these things? What are the non-monetary currencies that are employed, cited in scholarly communication?
So, I could talk about a lot of things that I think have been talked about a lot at the conference already and will continue to be talked about at Charleston and other conferences, like altmetrics and downloads from the institutional repository and that kind of thing, and those are all interesting to me. But I'm more interested personally in some other tougher nuts to crack. So success in scholarly publishing, I feel like, is a really difficult phenomenon to measure in a real sense. And the reason why I think it's so hard, or one of the reasons why I think it's so hard, is that the hallmarks of success in scholarly publishing are tied up in more than one kind of economy, and those economies aren't necessarily mutually supportive. And what I mean by that is that, as I already mentioned, sort of in passing, in response to the follow-up question Alex asked, that because so much of scholarly publishing has been done through a sales model, and sales has been considered a reliable metric for evaluating success, it's very hard to shake that notion. So when you start giving things away for free, it becomes really hard to articulate what success looks like, at least to people who are very familiar with the sales model, and we're all familiar with the sales model. We live in a capitalist society. So with that kind of hanging out there, I keep coming back to this question about, or this issue that I think it's really hard for press to be good at all the things that it tries to be good at. That historically, it had to be good at all these things. A little shop had to be good at acquiring, vetting, improving content on the editorial side, coordinating all the production side activities at a top quality level, ensuring widest possible dissemination and attention getting through the marketing side, maintaining a business office, coordinating fulfillment, etc. And some of these things, the editorial side, are things that really it's very hard to farm out. It's hard to do more cheaply than presses have been doing them in this highly formalized setting that Charles describes. But being good at a lot of the other things, copy editing, the value-added services that are often discussed, it's hard, and you don't get a lot of the prestige value from doing it well. If you're great at copy editing, that doesn't really earn you much with scholars. They might say that it does, but the fact is Cambridge doesn't do copy editing very well, and no one seems to. People might complain about it, but it doesn't seem to be hurting their sales. It also doesn't really seem to be hurting their prestige. So what does University of Akron Press do about this? Well, they can offshore their editing. I don't know if they do. I don't know how they handle it. They better. I sure hope they are doing that, because otherwise I don't know how they stay in business. But anyway, my point is that being good at a lot of these parts, these back office tasks, whatever you want to call them, being good at that doesn't mean being efficient at that. And we live in a kind of moment, an economic moment that really favors flexibility, right, nimbleness, and an ability to change the way that you do your work with some flexibility. So university presses often find themselves framing questions of success and failure through an extremely conservative lens, that of maintaining their integrity as a fully integrated end-to-end artisanal operation. And there are a lot of failure modes in that circuit that produce problems. Michigan publishing notwithstanding, library publishers benefit, I think, right now from their relative newness and low expectations. That won't last, but they're not currently expected to be financially independent. They're not currently expected to rise to the top of the prestige economy. In many ways, the discourse around library publishing represents something like an immature discourse in contrast to the very mature discourse of university press publishing. And I don't mean that immaturity is, in the sense of minority here. I mean it in the sense of as long as business success is the focus, library publishers have a chance to experiment in a way that university presses, although there is a lot of discussion of experimentation, it's harder. There's more resistance, and it costs money to experiment. Ultimately, the question really, for me, comes down to the prestige success. University presses are so good at that piece. And if I were running a university press right now, I would want to focus on maintaining the success in that category and sort of try to frame my expenses to cover that category. I know it's not that simple, but I'm not a press director either. The libraries need to build prestige in order to be successful ultimately, in order to make the case that which kind of costs?
Opportunity.
Opportunity, thank you. That the opportunity costs are worth the expense, and ultimately this comes down to finding a way to ensure use value, where a press focused on sales is focusing on surplus value in order to redistribute those incomes to do what it does well. Libraries need to focus on use value and delivering something that users over, let's say the next 10 years, increasingly come to recognize as something they can't live without because it serves their specific needs.
I have to say, I want to challenge something that you just said, in that university presses measure success by sales. And that's by far and away not the only metric that we use. It's the only, the most visible. But we define success in a scholarly program by the number of awards we receive, the number of reviews we get, the number of downloads, hits, tweets, everything that you just mentioned are also our ways of measuring success. So just kind of want to steer this away from we're only revenue driven, because it's not a reliable use model anymore.
Well, no, I mean, I wasn't suggesting that sales is the only focus. I did work at a university press for 3 years, so I am familiar with what you're talking about, of course. Ultimately, though, the bottom line, in my experience, is what everyone's concerned about. That no amount of good reviews will wash away being in the red. No amount of downloads, no amount of social media coverage, except, of course, the kind of social media coverage that happens when something like Akron shuts down temporarily. But that, I think, is a different conversation because that's activism. I think that you're right, that alt metrics and all of the things that sort of happen around a book, let's call them the marketing efforts, happen in both contexts. But the big difference in terms of success or failure is either do you have the budget numbers or do you not have the budget numbers? And one thing that I haven't mentioned is subsidies, right? That the universities are subsidizing presses often, not always, on the other side. And so what puzzles me is this conversation around adding value to scholarship and then asking for people to purchase it. I mean, because the other part of this conversation is the OA piece. But it's not simple, and if I oversimplified it, I'm sorry.
And I'm gonna, just in the interest of moving ahead and also getting Maria more involved in the conversation, I'm gonna use that as a way of gliding into a question, which is, should all library publishing offer some form of open access? And is that a viable goal in the near, medium, and long-term future?
When I was managing these things, one of my mantras was not open access, but sustainable access. That what we needed to do was to find a model, business model, if you would, or economic model, which would both support the work of the presses and be viable for the scholarly community. And open access in all its forms may be a piece of that. It may be supported by university investment. It may be supported by a different exchange of value through something like APCs. But it's really about the model that makes sense for that publication. When I used to talk to prospective partners about things we might publish and did they have to pay something or not, I'd say we have a preference for open access publishing, and that can move you up in our priority list. But let's figure out if that's going to keep your publication going. So no, I don't think that they must offer something open access, but they have to consider open access as part of a suite of strategies for supporting publications.
Anybody else have any thoughts on that issue? I know we could probably go on for months, but.
I'm interested you brought open access into it because, I mean, I come from the University of Pittsburgh. I'm not in the library, but I have a close relationship with the scholarly communication and publishing people there, and they've talked to my students a lot. And there, the whole mission of the publishing operation is open access, and it's all about encouraging journals, because the library publishes about 40 odd peer-reviewed journals and hosts about the same number again, most of which are not based in Pittsburgh at all. And it's all part of the mission to support open access to information. And they're intent on encouraging journals that are not open access at the moment to move to open access and to help people to do that. And so open access is the driver there.
Anybody else? I'm going to leave that one because, again, it could be a whole separate panel. And I want to sort of change gears slightly, go to a couple of specifics. And in this case, specifically to data publishing. Is that more the purview of a traditional or a library publisher, or perhaps a third kind of entity, or perhaps aggregators? What is the connection between publishing services and research data services? And Amy's going to take a crack at that.
So at most research institutions, mainly what they're trying to do is support infrastructure around data management plans because it's a risk mitigation issue for them. And academic institutions are incented or motivated to minimize risk, to avoid being audited by federal agencies, and to maintain the capacity to accept federal and private funds. And so it's, we talk a lot about data and data publishing and data management in libraries, and it's not just, oh, there's all this big data and we're going to store all of this, right? And it's very complicated for vice provosts of research who, on the one hand, are hearing from faculty, well, after I've published this paper, I have no interest whatsoever in having anything to do with that data. My work with this is done. They also, some of them have a proprietary sense around the data. And the other thing that, major research institutions are seeing is that, for federal agencies like the NIH who mandate open data, those agencies are supplying those repositories, right? They're huge genetics repositories provided by the federal government. So I do feel strongly that research data, looking between library-based publishing and traditional publishers is much more the purview of the institution and of library-based publishing. I think that the role for publishers mainly is to assist in the compliance with funder and institutional requirements around reproducibility, around transparency, around data sharing, but that's really best accomplished by publishers providing links to data that's held elsewhere, along with, say, an article. Obviously it's a library's mission to curate and archive and capture the scholarly output of the institution, and not so for publishers. So I imagine there are people here that disagree with me, but I would say data publishing is more the purview of libraries than universities, than university presses and traditional publishers.
I'd like to just supplement that with a thought, which is, I think this is this is actually a very exciting area where having a publishing entity within the library can be extremely helpful to the library, because I think about that a lot. It's like, you know, the library brings a lot of support and help and assistance to something like a university press. What does the university press or the publishing entity give back to its parent library? And it strikes me with libraries working in the data space that there's too much focus, especially when building data repositories, on the idea of data as a collection. And framing data repositories as collections of data has all kinds of implications around how you design the data repository. Framing data repositories as publishing platforms for data and bringing the sensibility of publishing into their design has all kinds of really positive implications for the sustainability of library investment in that space. So, you know, for example, you know, that means a focus on usage metrics. It means a focus on indexing of the data. It means a focus on providing opportunities for branding collections of data. So strong connections to incentivizing authors to put data out there in ways that it will maximize opportunities for reuse, rather than just depositing because they have to. So I think there's a very interesting interplay there that's exciting to explore.
I think we're just about out of time, and I think that's actually kind of a perfect place to end, because it really emphasizes the opportunities that libraries and presses working together and talking to each other constantly and having perhaps a formal relationship, perhaps not a formal relationship. But as Kathleen alluded to this morning, we all are going to have to act together to achieve whatever a sustainable scholarly communication model is going to be in the coming years. And library publishing and university press publishing and university publishing, all kinds, are going to have to be engaged with each other. So please join me in thanking our panelists. Thank you all.